welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, HBI.
HBI? I don't think he's been featured yet.
I don't think so. There's a new one to me. Today we're going to be talking about Sunn Classic Pictures, or you may also know them as Chick Sunn Classic Pictures.
I don't know them at all.
Well, maybe you will by the time we're done with this episode, Tony. So for this story, we're going back to the 1970s. And for those of you who remember our recent story about the late 1960s, things are kind of crazy in America at this time. People are not sure about how things are going, and there's a lot of tension, a lot of strife, a lot of negativity about how the world is developing. And that negativity and strife was very heavily reflected in Hollywood. There were a lot of darker, grittier movies. And movies that are lauded to this day, like Clockwork Orange, Dirty Harry, The Godfather, The French Connection. But the thing is, this was not a great time for family entertainment.
I bet not. It's like you got the Vietnam War. All the music is very political and angry. There's a lot happening.
And so you have a few studios putting out some family-oriented stuff. Disney's kind of doing their things. Early in the 70s, they put out the Aristocats. There's Bad News Bears comes out in this era. But there's a segment of the population that doesn't trust Disney. So people are looking for good, fun entertainment to take their kids to, and there's not really a great solution for these people to go to the movies. And that is where Sunn Classic Pictures comes in. Sunn Classic Pictures enters the movie-making scene in the early 70s, and bizarrely enough, in their heyday, they are a subsidiary of the Schick Razor Company. The company's owner at the time, Patrick Frawley, had bought a major stake in this new production company in the hopes that he could counter what he saw as the immoral liberal propaganda coming out of Hollywood. And this dude was hardcore conservative. He, at one time, pulled an advertisement off of ABC because they ran a story on one of their news segments that was critical of Richard Nixon.
Sounds like a dude with some pull and some very, very hard opinions.
Yes. And so he buys this movie studio. He says, listen, we're going to make family movies, G-rated stuff, things that Joe Public, who goes to church on Sunday, can take his kid to on Saturday afternoon and not be offended, not have to worry if there's going to be swears in there, sudden appearances of boobs, not worrying if people are shooting each other up or doing drugs. It's just going to be good, clean family entertainment.
It's an early Hallmark Channel.
It is very much like the Hallmark Channel in an interesting way, Tony, because not only do they have this specific audience in mind, like the Hallmark Channel does, they also had a specific kind of movie that they made over and over and over again. And this movie followed the general theme of these rugged mountain men. These sort of long-bearded, middle-aged white guys who were wandering in the woodness. There was always a lot of wildlife footage in these films. These dudes would always have some kind of a pet or a nature companion of some kind. A bear was a common one.
Did they do Guy on a Buffalo?
Guy on a Buffalo is almost like a parody of this.
I'm sure it is. Guy on a Buffalo is very, very violent.
If you've seen Guy on a Buffalo, or the movie that created that meme, The Buffalo Rider, which has a great riff tracks of it, by the way, you can have sort of a picture of this, where it's this guy who's wandering through the wilderness. He's unattached and pure and connected with nature, and the vast outside world just doesn't get him. He may be on the run from some crime that he's been accused of or didn't commit or did accidentally and doesn't want to be convicted of. But if you've got that picture in your mind, you understand the early days of Sunn Classic Pictures. Now, Sunn Classic Pictures is based out of Utah. A lot of Mormon influence. We'll get into that a little bit more specifically in a bit. But they don't really have a shot of going up against Hollywood on their own turf and beating them at their own game. They can't do what Hollywood is doing in the way Hollywood is doing it and expect to beat Hollywood. So instead, they do an end around. They come at it from the flank and devise their own distribution strategy that let them get around a lot of the established gatekeepers for what ought to be shown in movie theaters. What they did was they would rent out an entire movie theater for a flat fee, and then they would play their films in that theater for a week or maybe two, and they would advertise it locally. So you'd be driving down the road in your car, and you would hear an ad come on the radio, and they would say, "Coming soon to a theater for a limited engagement near you, Tucklet, the movie about a man forced to hunt down his best friend who is also a bear. See it this weekend." And you would put your kids in the car and go out to see this movie, and then it would be gone the next weekend because they moved on to the next town.
It's an interesting way of doing distribution. I mean, back in the day, whenever it cost a lot more to get like 35 millimeter and everything out, it kind of makes sense.
Right, so this is the roadshow version of showing movies. Quentin Tarantino kind of tried to revive it when he did his Hateful Eight release. You know, had like it going around theater by theater by theater. That was just sort of a gimmick, but that was a legitimate way to show a movie at this point, where you would just send the prints around to different theaters. So there's two benefits for Sunn Classic in releasing their movies this way. Firstly, they get to pocket any profit over and above the rental fee of the theater. They're running the theater, they're getting the concessions profits, they're essentially pocketing anything above their initial outlay. And secondly, they are staying ahead of the word of mouth, because this is the days before Rotten Tomatoes, and Siskel and Ebert are gonna be a thing towards the end of this story, but really these movies aren't being seen by the big name critics, if those even are a thing. So if your local newspaper critic sees this movie and pans it, well, you already went and saw it because it was only in town for the weekend, and now it's on to the next town, and they don't get the local newspaper from Phoenix or wherever. So it's moving ahead of any negative word of mouth where people are telling each other, "Ah, man, did you see that terrible movie?"
I do like that idea, because it's like, you really, really don't want that press whenever you're producing low-budget things. Sometimes you'll have something that's a really good hit, but otherwise you just want to like collect that money and keep on rolling.
This practice, by the way, was known as four-walling, based on the idea that you bought all four walls of the theater and you owned it until the movie left town. Now, the movies they released throughout this period are, as I already mentioned in my little radio ad, I hope you guys enjoyed my radio announcer voice, Tucklat, Toklat, I think I'm pronouncing that right. That was a movie about a man forced to hunt down his best friend who was also a grizzly bear. Then there was When the North Wind Blows, which was about a man who flees into the wilderness after accidentally killing a boy. And when these two films came out, they were okay. Like, they did okay business for Sunn Classic, but they weren't blowing the doors off. They weren't the success that Sunn Classic was looking for. And yet, Sunn Classic decides, we've already made two of these Mountain Man movies. We're going to make another one. We're coming at this a third time, another Mountain Man movie, and for this movie, they hire an unknown director. My sense of this was they thought, we've had two strikeouts. The worst that could happen is we have another mediocre success here. Maybe this guy will have some new ideas. He'll bring something interesting to the table. And this director was a guy named Charles Sellier Jr. Charles Sellier Jr. is an interesting character. He was a Mormon at this time, although he had been a Catholic before this time, and he would go on to be a Protestant afterward. Interesting religious evolution that I'm not 100% sure what's going on with it, because I couldn't find a ton of autobiographical information about him. He had dropped out of high school after the 10th grade. He came from Louisiana, And he shows up at Sunn Classic Pictures with some very specific ideas about how to make movies. Now, Sunn Classic had always relied on audience testing for their movies. They would call people up and say, hey, would you be interested in this kind of movie? Would you find this kind of thing interesting? And really take a lot of that feedback to heart. But Sellier took it to the next level. Since these Wilderness Man films relied heavily on stock footage, Charles Sellier had people sit in a theater with a knob that they could turn one direction or another based on how interested they were in the footage, and just watch reel after reel after reel of stock footage. And he took the stuff that people found most interesting in the stock footage and then built his movie around that.
They had a bit about that in The Simpsons once.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they've got the kids in a thing trying to test what movies are going to be good and bad. And they're just like, there's some where the kids end up like, someone makes fun of Ralph and he ends up crying and just turning it to no, even though it's nothing related to the movies. There's just some silly stuff that happens in there. And then whenever there's like some muscle-bound dude on the screen, like people grab each other's things and go like, yes, 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 like implying like people are gay and so on. It's a dumb little bit, but it was from the 90s Simpsons.
Well, I don't think they were just basing that on Sunn Classic Pictures. Other movies do get tested this way in various degrees. Studios put their movies out and they try to figure out if people are going to be interested and where they're interested. And this is another one of these stories that had a bit that was like cooler in some of the tellings that turned out not to be true, where some people were saying they were actually hooking up electrodes to people's brains and testing their skin conductance at certain parts of the movie. That apparently was not the case. It was more standard than that. But
it's so much better of a story, though.
I know, right? Stupid reality getting in the way of our great stories.
That's the story of the Bad Ideas show sometimes. It's like, oh, this is not as sensational as I hoped.
The movie that emerged from this process was called The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, and it was a huge hit. It was made for a budget of $140,000, and the film would go on to eventually gross $65 million before being spun off into a TV series that would run for 2 more seasons and end in a TV movie.
That is a hefty chunk of change for the times.
It's still not bad, right? If your indie film runs for $65 million and you only put $20 million or something into it, you probably are okay with that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Anytime you like keystone a movie where you just double up on the cost, that's whenever it's considered commercially successful. And they did that like 100 times over.
Yes, this is almost, it's not quite to the level of Paranormal Activity, right? Like that film leveraged itself into outer space with something like a $20,000 budget and $200 million return, but it's in that type of ballpark.
Definitely. It's Blair Witch and so on.
However, Grizzly Adams wasn't the only success that Sunn Pictures experienced. Around the same time, they bought the distribution rights to the 1970 hit German documentary Chariots of the Gods.
Is that the Graham Hancock book?
Based on the best-selling book of the same name, Tony. Chariots of the Gods popularized the idea that the wonders of the ancient world were created or influenced by aliens.
I love it. I'm so happy that they brought the aliens into this. I'm making the hand gestures now. It's Giorgio Tsoukalis up in here.
This movie had been a big hit in Germany and around Europe at the time, but Sunn Pictures buys the rights to bring it to America. They recut it and redub it with a voiceover by Rod Serling of The Twilight Zone, and they retitle it In Search of Ancient Astronauts. And this was also wildly successful for them. So here in the same year, these guys released 2 different movies, both of which are big hits, and they have a choice in front of them. They can go down the road of the wholesome mountain man running away from the law that is unjustly coming after him, or they can go down the road of pseudoscientific, quote-unquote, documentaries and try to pursue that interest. And since they've already had 2 failures of the Mountain Man thing, and they probably don't want to dilute the well, Tony, especially because there's still a TV series that's going to be going on during the time that they're producing the rest of this stuff, they decide they're going to pursue the quote-unquote documentary option.
I kept waiting. We're like 18 minutes in, and we hadn't got to the bad idea yet, because Chariots of Fire is great.
Here comes the bad idea, Tony. Because in 1975, on the heels of In Search of Ancient Astronauts, which was about ancient aliens influencing human history, narrated by Rod Serling, they release The Outer Space Connection, which is about ancient aliens influencing human history, narrated by Rod Serling.
Wow, they are just pounding that home.
It's like the last thing Rod Serling does, too. It's a little bit sad.
I mean, it sounds like the first one was fine, but it's like that's just some sequelitis right there.
Well, I'm sure he was just there for the paycheck. You know, he's got a cool sounding voice. He's got an authoritative type presence. They said, hey, come and say things for our documentary. And he said, okay, fine. I guess I could use the money. So I don't want to like diss Rod Serling for showing up in this. I just, maybe not the greatest legacy ending thing.
This is the stuff that gets forgotten. Everybody's just going to remember him for the Twilight Zone anyway.
That's fair. In the very same year, they also released The Mysterious Monsters, which was another documentary, this time about cryptozoological creatures like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. And this is notable because it's the first wide release of the famous Patterson Bigfoot footage.
Still not seeing where the bad idea is here. Like, cryptozoology is dumb, but it's also very fun.
Well, I think it's important to remember where these guys started, right? They started out as wholesome, evangelical type, conservative movie makers who just want to make something for dads to take their families to, or moms to take their families. Just like, you just want to feel safe dropping your kid off at the theater. A Sunn Classic Picture, it's going to be rated G. And we'll get into specifics and sort of my thoughts in the future, but really I think the spirit of the bad idea here is that these guys start just telling lies because their audience is interested in these lies.
So they took the History Channel approach.
Essentially.
They're like, oh, look at this mermaid documentary.
On the one hand, you could argue, well, it's not a bad idea because people love those things on the History Channel. But if you would rather watch history than lies, maybe you would think that that pivot to lies is a bad idea for the History Channel.
It's especially interesting because it was supposed to be from like a Christian conservative guy that was trying to make family-friendly entertainment that pivots into lies, cryptozoology, and like I'm not going to fully discount the stuff that Graham Hancock has to say because some of his theories are very fun and possibly plausible, but it's just not all that verifiable.
Over the next years, they put out a lot more of these pseudoscience-based things, and in 1977, they switched gears a little bit to pseudo-history. They put out what is maybe their most infamous film from the stuff I was looking at, and this is a movie called The Lincoln Conspiracy. The Lincoln Conspiracy is a movie about the theory that Abraham Lincoln was not killed by John Wilkes Booth because John Wilkes Booth was a bitter Southerner who didn't like Abraham Lincoln winning the war and freeing the slaves and all that stuff, but rather that it was a conspiracy of the Northerners with John Wilkes Booth to kidnap Abraham Lincoln to stop him from going easy on the South during the Reconstruction era, which then went bad because John Wilkes Booth just went crazy and decided to kill Lincoln, and things went off the rails.
That seems like some major revisionist history. I'm not sure what their sources would be on that sort of thing.
Well, they did manage to put out a book at the same time, written by the same people who had produced the film, right? Like Sunn Classic Pictures. They get into the multilateral revenue stream thing where they're releasing the movie, they've got the tie-in book, or is the movie a tie-in to the book? You can't tell.
I wish they'd just go full, like, Weekly World News and add, like, some sort of alien to that conspiracy with Lincoln.
The interesting thing about this movie as well is that it takes another step in the Sunn Classic formula. Before now, they were doing these talking heads style documentaries where people would stand in front of a camera in an observatory or in front of a chalkboard or somewhere that made them look like they knew what they were talking about. And they may have knew something what they were talking about. You know, microbiologists can believe in UFOs, Tony. Doesn't make them right, and it doesn't make them wrong about microbiology, but yeah.
I
what am I
thought
gonna
I
say?
had a rebuttal there, but I did not. I was going to do something
But the
about Ben
Lincoln
Carson.
conspiracy. But when they shot the Lincoln conspiracy and they took it to test audiences, the test audiences overwhelmingly reacted far more positively to the reenactment portions of the movie than they did to the talking head portions. So they just recut the movie into the reenactment while still maintaining the "this really happened and they don't want you to know" tone of their other documentaries. There was still a voiceover at the beginning. There was a guy telling people, and he was initially on screen for the documentary, but they decided again that that wasn't going to work. But his voice appears in the intro to this with some text that says, "You may have been told what you thought was the real story of Abraham Lincoln, but here, for your viewing pleasure, what has been hidden is revealed." I also have to say, I watched a few minutes of Lincoln Conspiracy. It wasn't the part after Lincoln had been killed. It was just him standing in a room talking with some of his generals about the philosophy of Reconstruction. And I gotta say, I did find it very compelling. I was like, this is some good Abraham Lincoln stuff right here.
At least they got something right.
Well, I don't know if they got it right, but they got it fun. Sunn knew their audience was made up of a large percentage of religious people, so they also put out In Search of Noah's Ark in 1976, and Beyond and Back, a film about the afterlife, in 1978, and In Search of Historic Jesus in 1979. All of these are, again, things that take unreliable or unverifiable witness testimony and pseudo experts and put them together in what looks like a documentary format and presents it as, here are the facts that people are trying to hide from you about the afterlife, or about whether Jesus visited the Buddha, or whether there is a real Noah's Ark in Turkey.
I have actually seen Beyond and Back, if I'm remembering right, like old VHS tape.
Apparently, for people who saw this as a child, and remember, these are all rated G, but this is about dying, and in some cases, the people in Beyond and Back say they went to hell. So it's actually pretty horrifying for some people by some of the accounts that I listened to, where they were talking about, like, it messed them up for a while. You know, before these people were either able to or interested in watching horror movies, they're plunked into the movie theater by a mom who trusts Sunn Classic Pictures to watch this film about dying and going to actual hell. And it did not leave a great fun impression on them.
Yeah, that should probably be rated PG.
Yeah, at least, right? The MPAA was different at the time, and it's still kind of weird. Maybe that'll be a bad idea one of these days, Tony.
Maybe. We have definitely talked about that. Like 5 Facts over on the Human Echoes channel gets a lot of... The MPAA rated this X. They took out 2 seconds, and now it was rated G. There's a lot of that in the 70s.
To be fair, that was a really raunchy 2 seconds, though, Tony. Between their four-walling business model success and an uncanny understanding of their target demographics, Sunn Classic Pictures did very well for themselves monetarily, averaging $15 million per film in box office receipts. But still, their methods received very little notice from Hollywood. Charles Sellier Jr., the man who I mentioned earlier, would go on to say in an interview, "If I was in Hollywood now, I'd be Cecil B. DeMille." I couldn't tell if he was saying that bitterly or sort of jokingly, but he was very much understanding of this theme. And Charles Sellier Jr. would go on to do some very interesting stuff in this vein. Sunn's success would actually prove to be their undoing, because in 1980, they were bought out by Taft International Pictures, which was an associate of Taft Broadcasting, and the management at Taft immediately began making changes. Now, this is one of the bad ideas that you can draw out of this. If you buy a successful company, don't immediately change everything the company does. Because Taft takes Sunn Classic Pictures, which makes G-rated films and has a very specific type of distribution model, and immediately stop making G-rated films and redo the distribution model. Their first change is to release their first non-G-rated film, the PG-rated Hangar 18, which was followed closely by the R-rated horror film The Boogans. They also released a film adaptation of Stephen King's killer dog novel Cujo, and as I mentioned earlier, they changed the distribution network. They started, instead of doing the four-walling thing and using the distribution network that Sunn had built up for themselves over the years, they just sent it out to the big studios to distribute, which meant that their margins were cut by the fact that they had to share the revenues with other people, and the name brand that had been sort of trusted by parents to be G-rated and relatively tame was now putting out R-rated Stephen King horror films. Maybe not what mom and dad are looking for, and things just go downhill pretty quickly.
Yeah, that'd be like buying a distillery that makes whiskey that's a name brand that's been around for 100 years and then turning it into tequila.
I was going to say Kool-Aid, but sure. I guess that's maybe it's a little bit still on brand, but yes.
Well, the reason I was pulling that is recently some of the major distillers out in Kentucky had been bought, and people were worried it was going to change the taste because it was a Japanese organization. And they were like, why would we buy it if we were like, why would we change it? We bought it because it makes money.
Yeah, well, that's a good philosophy, Tony. Those guys obviously traveled in time from the future when they listened to this episode and learned that you should not buy something successful and immediately change everything about it.
Yes.
Charles Sellier, who I mentioned earlier had directed The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, went on to produce a wide variety of conspiracy and Christian-focused documentaries for television, but not before making a very odd detour to direct one of the most infamous slasher films of the 80s, Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Which is a fantastic slasher. It's so
If
good.
you're into slashers, it's a great movie. But it does feature a woman being impaled on the antlers of a trophy deer by Santa Claus. So,
and like gratuitous sexual content with Santa and all sorts of strange stuff in that one, really.
Yes, it seems like maybe not the kind of thing that the man who was a Mormon and made The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams would go on to do. I didn't include that specifically as a bad idea, but it was just this wild detour, because if you look at his filmography, the things that he produced, it's Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, all these weird documentaries for Sunn Pictures, dead in the middle of it, Silent Night, Deadly Night, and then he goes back to weird sort of pseudo-historical Christian-themed things and also alien conspiracies for television. He never does another thing like this, and it's wildly unpopular with the same people who he had targeted with his G-rated movies in the 70s.
That might be part of why so many people tried to boycott that one, because it was like related to Sunn Pictures.
It wasn't the same. Sunn Pictures didn't produce it. It was just the guy, the same person who was associated with Sunn Pictures. I don't know if enough people at the time would have known the name Charles Sellier Jr. to be like, wait a minute, the director of The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams? Making a Killer Santa movie? Not in my town! I think they were just mad about the idea of Santa killing people, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, true.
Sunn eventually went out of business completely in the late 80s, but their legacy continues to this day. The Lincoln Conspiracy movie was played in classrooms on VHS form by teachers who needed to fill time, often filled with very little commentary offered by the teachers to correct the film's gross misinterpretations of actual history. I went on Amazon to read reviews of the book, The Lincoln Conspiracy, and one of the guys on there was saying, they need to teach this in schools. And I thought, my dude, I'm here because they did. And I don't think they probably should have. But, you know, you got your coach who's in for the weekend, or not for the weekend, but you got the football coach who's in taking over for the history teacher who's on vacation, and he needs something to put in the giant rolling rack TV thing that they pulled into your classroom during that period of time. And hey, here's a movie with Abraham Lincoln on the cover. That sounds like history to me. In Search of Ancient Astronauts and movies like it from Sunn helped to popularize the ancient aliens conspiracy that persists in the popular imagination to this day. And while it would be foolish to pin the entire blame for this craze on Sunn Classic Pictures, there was obviously an appetite for those kinds of ideas, and they catered to it shamelessly. And here, as I alluded to earlier, is what I think the bad idea was. Sunn Classic Pictures started out as a company that relied heavily on audience testing. They prided themselves on knowing what their audience liked and giving that to them. But at some point along the way, they stopped creating stories that they knew their audience would like and started telling their audience lies that they knew that they would like. Their reliance on audience testing combined with their slide into documentary filmmaking meant that the studio that set out to make wholesome family entertainment eventually became a factory of finely tuned lies. Like the yellow journalism of the 19th century and the fake news of today, Sunn Classic Pictures trafficked in the idea that everything people already believed was true. And that, to me, is one of the worst ideas of all. That is all we have for this week, folks. Thank you so much for listening. I found this story to be fascinating. From the weird ancient aliens movies that kind of were forgotten and yet were very influential in their way too, to the strange life of Charles Cellier Jr. going from wild success with Grizzly Adams and wholesome family entertainment to the oddness of directing a single slasher film in the 1980s to then going back to doing other stuff. Every bit of this story really just spoke to me, and I hope that I've managed to tell it in a way that was interesting to you as well. If you have bad ideas that you would like us to cover, you should send them over to our email address at badideasshow@gmail.com, or you can leave them in the YouTube comments if you're watching the YouTube edition of this podcast. And if you really want to help support us, you can go over to patreon.com/humanechoes and become a patron, where that helps keep the wheels rolling for this show and lots of the other stuff that we do.
Thank you all. Have a good week.
Bye, and don't fall for fake news.